Welcome to Talk About It in English, where we build the exact English you need for real life. Today we are going to build a verbal bridge that will finally stop fast-talking native speakers from talking over you. Imagine it is Friday night at a loud restaurant. 3 colleagues are rapid-firing stories, and you have an amazing story to add. But as you quickly translate the verbs in your head and open your mouth to speak, they have already changed the subject, leaving you to just sip your water and feel completely invisible.
For my first 2 years living abroad, this was my life. I was just the quiet, smiling one at every dinner because I was waiting for a polite pause that never came.
In the next few minutes, you will learn the 3 bridge phrases you must use to interrupt confidently, grab the table's attention, and buy yourself time to speak.
That feeling of sitting at the table, holding your glass of water, and just watching the conversation bounce back and forth like a tennis match is one of the most exhausting experiences for any English learner. You understand every single joke. You understand the vocabulary they are using. If someone gave you a transcript of the dinner, you would score 100% on a comprehension test. But because the speed is so fast, you are physically locked out of the experience.
And it is not just exhausting, it is incredibly isolating. You start to worry that your colleagues think you're boring, or worse, that they think you do not understand them. The reality is that your brain is just doing an incredible amount of heavy lifting. When you are at the A2 or B1 level, your passive understanding is always miles ahead of your active speaking. When a colleague tells a story, you hear the English, your brain processes the meaning, you think of a response, you translate that response from your native language into English, you check the grammar, and then you try to speak. That entire process takes about 3 to 5 seconds.
And in a lively native speaker conversation, a 3-second pause is a lifetime. Someone else has already jumped in. The window closes. I remember sitting at a pub in London with my new coworkers. One of them was telling a hilarious story about getting completely lost on the subway. I had a very similar story about taking the wrong train and ending up in a completely different city. I sat there building the perfect sentence in my head. I made sure I was using the past perfect tense correctly. I made sure I had the right preposition. I finally opened my mouth to deliver my perfectly crafted sentence, and the guy next to me suddenly slammed his hand on the table and shouted about a football match that was playing on the television behind me. The topic was gone. My perfect sentence died in my throat. I did not speak again for the rest of the night.
That story perfectly illustrates what we call the myth of the polite pause. This is the biggest invisible barrier that stops learners from speaking in group settings. In most traditional classrooms, and frankly in many different cultures around the world, conversation is taught as a turn-based game. The teacher speaks, you listen. When the teacher finishes, you raise your hand, you wait to be acknowledged, and then you speak. Even in daily life in many cultures, it is considered highly disrespectful to begin speaking while someone else is still finishing their sentence. You are supposed to wait for a clear, silent pause.
Exactly. So we carry that cultural programming into an English-speaking environment. We wait for the silence. But if you put 3 or 4 native English speakers at a dinner table, especially if they are friends or comfortable colleagues, that silent pause does not exist. They don't wait for the green light to speak. They overlap. Someone is finishing a sentence and someone else is already starting the next one while laughing. If you wait for the polite pause, you will be waiting until the restaurant closes and everyone goes home.
It is so important to reframe how we view this overlapping. As a learner, you might feel that interrupting is rude, aggressive, or impolite, but in casual English group dynamics, overlapping is often a sign of active listening and enthusiasm. When someone jumps into your story with a high-energy reaction, they are not disrespecting you, they are showing you that they are highly engaged with what you are saying. They are co-creating the energy of the conversation. Once you realize that jumping in is actually a compliment to the group's energy, you can drop the guilt of feeling like you are being rude.
That story perfectly illustrates what we call the myth of the polite pause. It is the biggest invisible barrier that stops learners from speaking in group settings. In most traditional classrooms, and frankly in many different cultures around the world, conversation is taught as a turn-based game. The teacher speaks, you listen. When the teacher finishes, you raise your hand, you wait to be acknowledged, and then you speak. Even in daily life in many cultures, it is considered highly disrespectful to begin speaking while someone else is still finishing their sentence. You are supposed to wait for a clear, silent pause.
Exactly. So we carry that cultural programming into an English-speaking environment. We wait for the silence. But if you put 3 or 4 native English speakers at a dinner table, especially if they are friends or comfortable colleagues, that silent pause does not exist. They don't wait for the green light to speak. They overlap. Someone is finishing a sentence and someone else is already starting the next one while laughing. If you wait for the polite pause, you will be waiting until the restaurant closes and everyone goes home. It is so important to reframe how we view this overlapping. As a learner, you might feel that interrupting is rude, aggressive, or impolite, but in casual English group dynamics, overlapping is often a sign of active listening and enthusiasm. When someone jumps into your story with a high-energy reaction, they are not disrespecting you, they are showing you that they are highly engaged with what you are saying. They are co-creating the energy of the conversation. Once you realize that jumping in is actually a compliment to the group's energy, you can drop the guilt of feeling like you are being rude.
Learning that completely changed my life. I realized I didn't need better grammar to survive Friday night dinners. I didn't even need faster translation skills. I needed a tool to stop the traffic. I needed a way to put sound into the air immediately, which would force the group to look at me, and that would buy my brain the 3 seconds it needed to finish translating my story. That's exactly what a bridge phrase is. It's an automatic, memorized sequence of words that you can throw into the middle of the noise to claim your space.
Let us break down the first of our 3 tools. We call this the reminds me hijack. This is for the exact moment when the current topic connects perfectly to a story or thought you have, and you need to jump in before the topic moves on. The phrase you are going to use is, "Actually, that reminds me of," followed by your topic. For example, "Actually, that reminds me of my trip to Spain," or "Actually, that reminds me of a story about my old boss."
The magic of this phrase is how it creates a bridge between the person who is currently speaking and the story you want to tell. You're not just aggressively changing the subject, which would be rude. By saying, "That reminds me of," you are honoring the other person's story. You are telling them that their words were so interesting that they sparked a memory in your mind. People love hearing that they inspired a thought in someone else. It's the ultimate conversational flattery, wrapped in an interruption.
The words are simple, but the secret to making this work is entirely in the delivery, specifically your volume and your physical breath. You cannot whisper a bridge phrase. If you quietly say, "Actually, that reminds me," while looking down at your plate, the fast-paced conversation will just roll right over you. You have to signal to the room that you are taking the floor. To do this, you need to use a sharp, audible intake of breath and hit the word "actually" with a bright, elevated pitch.
I had to practice this in my apartment alone because I was naturally so soft-spoken. You literally have to breathe in through your mouth loudly enough that the person sitting next to you hears the breath. That sound of a sharp breath is a universal human signal that someone is about to speak. It causes the people around you to subconsciously pause for a split second. That split second is your window. You take that sharp breath and you project the word "actually" louder than your normal speaking volume. "Actually, that reminds me of my flight to Tokyo."
Let us talk about the rhythm and connected speech of this phrase, because if you say it like a robot, it loses its natural power. We do not say every word separately. We do not say, "Actually, that reminds me of." We link the words together so they flow like one long sound. The S at the end of reminds connects smoothly to the M in me, and the E in me connects with a tiny hidden Y sound to the word of. It sounds like reminds me of, reminds me of. Actually, that reminds me of.
When you lock that exact rhythm into your muscle memory, you don't have to think about English grammar at all. You just hear a keyword in the conversation, like the word taxi, and your mouth automatically fires off the phrase. Actually, that reminds me of my taxi ride yesterday. By the time you reach the word yesterday, you have successfully stolen the attention of the table. All eyes are on you, and because you used a memorized phrase, your brain was free during those 2 seconds to figure out how to start your actual story.
If you are finding these real-life survival techniques helpful, make sure to subscribe to the channel right now so you never miss a lesson that helps you speak English with confidence in the real world. Now, let us move to a slightly different scenario, which brings us to our second phrase, the time travel technique. What happens if you miss your window? What happens if you have a brilliant thought, but the conversation is moving so fast that they completely abandon the topic? 5 minutes ago, they were talking about remote work, and now they're talking about Italian food. Your thought about remote work is still stuck in your head, but it feels too late to say it.
This used to paralyze me. I thought that once a topic changed, it was dead forever. I thought it would be socially awkward to bring something up from 5 minutes ago. But pay close attention to native speakers in a meeting or at a pub. They do this constantly. They will suddenly pull the conversation entirely backward just because they thought of a good point. They're not afraid to time travel, and you shouldn't be either. You just need the right vehicle to get there smoothly.
The phrase you need for this is going back to what you said earlier about, and then you insert the old topic. For example, going back to what you said earlier about remote work, or going back to what you said earlier about the new software. This phrase acts as a conversational steering wheel. It acknowledges that you know the topic has changed, which proves you have social awareness, but it firmly requests that the group travels back in time with you.
I use this phrase almost every single day at the office, especially in group meetings, where the project manager is talking very fast and jumping from slide to slide. Often I'll realize I have a crucial question about budget, but the manager is already talking about marketing. Instead of panicking, I just wait for a tiny dip in their energy, and I deploy the phrase. Going back to what you said earlier about the budget for Q3, it works flawlessly. No one ever acts annoyed. In fact, it makes you look incredibly thoughtful, like you've been deeply analyzing their previous points.
Let us look closely at the mechanics of this phrase, because the delivery here is completely different from the reminds me hijack. With our first phrase, you had to be fast, bright, and loud to interrupt the flow. With the time travel technique, you actually want to do the opposite. You have already missed the window, so there is no need to rush. You want to stretch the words out to force the room to slow down and match your new tempo.
Exactly. You drag out the very first word, going back to what you said. When you elongate that O sound in going, it acts as a calming anchor for the whole table. It signals that we are shifting gears. You also want to drop your pitch slightly. A lower, calmer voice projects authority. It tells the room, I have something valuable to add to a previous point, and it is worth your time to listen.
The connected speech here is also very important for sounding natural. We do not pronounce the hard G at the end of going, and we do not pronounce a sharp T in the word to. It softens down. Going back to what you said earlier about the budget. And notice the phrase what you. When spoken naturally, the T in what and the Y in you blend together to make a CH sound. Whatcha. Going back to what you said earlier about the budget.
When you practice shadowing this at home, really focus on that smooth, flowing rhythm. Going back to what you said earlier. It should feel like a wave rolling onto a beach, slow, steady, and inevitable. And the best part about this phrase is the relief it gives you. If you are sitting at that dinner table and you feel the panic rising because you missed your chance to speak, you can just take a breath, let the conversation go wherever it wants, and know that you have the power to pull it back whenever you are ready.
That brings us to our third and final tool, which is arguably the most powerful phrase for an A2 or B1 learner who is feeling completely overwhelmed by the speed of the group. We call this the yes and anchor. Sometimes you do not have a long story to tell. Sometimes the idea of holding the attention of 3 native speakers for a 2-minute story is just too terrifying. You do not want to be the main character. You just want to prove that you are in the room, that you understand, and that you belong in the conversation.
I cannot emphasize enough how important this strategy is for your confidence. When I first started trying to speak up in group settings, I put so much pressure on myself to deliver these massive, entertaining monologues. I thought I had to be a comedian. Of course, my English was not ready for that, so I would stumble, get embarrassed, and retreat back into silence. The breakthrough happened when I realized I did not need to build a whole house. I just needed to add one single brick to someone else's house.
That is exactly what the yes and anchor does. It is the lowest friction way to enter a fast-moving conversation. Instead of introducing a brand new idea, you forcefully validate the person who is currently speaking, and you attach one tiny, simple thought to the end of their sentence. The core phrase is, "I completely agree," and to add to that, or alternatively, "exactly," and the crazy thing is,
Think about how this feels for the person speaking. If a colleague is passionately complaining about how terrible the city traffic has become, and you jump in with, "I completely agree," and to add to that, the parking prices are just insane lately, you have just made them feel heard and supported. You are acting as their wingman in the conversation. Because you are agreeing with them, they will naturally stop talking to let you finish your point. They want to hear you agree with them. You're instantly part of the dynamic without having to do the heavy lifting of starting a new topic.
the psychological benefit here is huge. It removes the burden of finding the perfect entry point. You do not have to hunt for a gap in the noise. You just wait for someone to state an opinion that you understand and you loudly validate it. Let us look at the pronunciation of the word completely, because this is the anchor that cuts through the restaurant noise. You do not want to mumble this. You need to hit the second syllable with a lot of force. Completely.
The P sound in completely needs to have a burst of air behind it, and the E vowel sound needs to be stretched. I completely agree. That sharp, percussive sound acts like a drum beat. It snaps people out of their own thoughts and draws their attention to you. Even if there are plates clinking and background music playing, a well-pronounced I completely agree will slice right through the environment.
And let us look at the second variation. Exactly, and the crazy thing is, this is fantastic when someone is telling a surprising or frustrating story. Notice how we use the phrase, "the crazy thing is." For A2 and B1 learners, there is a temptation to use very literal academic English. You might want to say, "Yes, and an additional surprising fact is," but that sounds like a textbook, not a Friday night dinner. "The crazy thing is" sounds incredibly natural, native, and casual.
It is a perfect setup phrase because it builds anticipation. When you say, "and the crazy thing is," everyone at the table leans in slightly. They want to know what the crazy thing is. It hooks their attention instantly. And again, you only need to provide a very short, simple sentence to follow it up. Exactly. And the crazy thing is, the trains are delayed again today. You have successfully participated, you have spoken natural English, and you did not have to panic over complex grammar tenses.
The key to mastering all 3 of these bridge phrases is recognizing that they are physical reflexes, not just vocabulary words. You cannot just write these phrases down in a notebook and expect them to magically appear in your mouth when you are under pressure at a loud restaurant. When your heart is beating fast and you are surrounded by fast-talking native speakers, your brain goes into a mild fight-or-flight mode. In that state, you lose access to the complex grammar rules you studied in a quiet room. You only have access to your deep muscle memory.
That is the truest statement about learning a language. Muscle memory is everything. I used to write down idioms and phrases on flashcards, look at them and think, okay, I know what that means. But knowing what a phrase means is completely different from having the physical coordination in your jaw, tongue, and lips to produce the phrase rapidly under stress. You have to train these bridge phrases the same way an athlete trains a physical movement. You have to repeat them out loud, standing in your living room hundreds of times.
You have to shadow the intonation, the sharp breath, the stretched vowels, and the connected speech until the phrase feels like a single, unbreakable unit of sound. When you drill, "Actually, that reminds me of," over and over again, it stops being 6 separate words. It becomes one single sound block. When you are at the dinner table, you do not have to construct the sentence. You just press play on that sound block, and your mouth does the work automatically.
This shift from passive understanding to active, reflexive speaking is what finally cured my silent dinners. I went from being the person who just smiled and nodded to the person who could confidently steer the conversation. I did not suddenly learn 5,000 new vocabulary words. I did not suddenly perfect my past conditional tenses. I simply learned how to interrupt politely, how to time travel back to comfortable topics, and how to anchor myself to other people's opinions. These are conversational mechanics, and anyone can learn them.
Your challenge for today is to build that muscle memory immediately. As soon as this video ends, open up a group podcast or a talk show on YouTube featuring native English speakers. As you listen, every single time you agree with a point they make, or every time their conversation sparks a thought in your mind, I want you to physically pause the video and shout out one of your new bridge phrases to your empty room. Train your voice to break the silence.
You have the vocabulary, you have the stories, and now you have the tools to make sure everyone hears them. Do not let the speed of the conversation steal your voice anymore.
Keep practicing, trust your voice, and we'll see you in the next episode.